The heavy steel door clicked shut behind me with the finality of a prison cell, and I immediately knew I'd made a mistake. The mailroom in the basement of our apartment building had always felt claustrophobic, but now, with the handle refusing to turn no matter how desperately I twisted it, the cramped space seemed to shrink around me like a closing fist. I was Daniel Chen, 24 years old, and I'd managed to lock myself in a room barely larger than a closet at 11:30 on a Thursday night. The irony wasn't lost on me. An architecture student who spent his days designing spaces that people could actually navigate successfully, trapped by the most basic function of a door. The mailroom smelled like old paper and industrial cleaning solution, lit by a single bulb that cast harsh shadows across the rows of metal boxes. I'd come down to check for a package I'd been expecting. Textbooks for my structural engineering course that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. And in my distracted fumbling with keys and mailbox numbers, I must have let the door swing shut without propping it open. I tried the handle again, then threw my shoulder against the door, achieving nothing except a sharp pain and the hollow echo of my efforts bouncing off concrete walls. My phone, naturally, was sitting on my kitchen counter 3 floors up, charging for the night. That's when I heard footsteps in the hallway beyond the door, measured, unhurried steps that suggested someone who wasn't particularly concerned about the lateness of the hour. "Hello?" I called out, feeling slightly ridiculous. "Is someone there?" The footsteps paused, then approached the mailroom door. "You locked in there?" The voice was deeper than I'd expected, with a roughness that suggested cigarettes or whiskey or perhaps just the accumulated weight of years. "Yeah," I said, leaning my forehead against the cool metal of the door. "The handle's completely stuck. I can't get it to turn at all." "Hold on," the voice said. "Sometimes you have to lift up while you turn." These old doors are temperamental. I heard him working at the handle from the outside, and after a moment that felt like hours, the lock clicked and the door swung open. I found myself face to face with my neighbor from 6B, Daniel, though I didn't know his name yet. He was older, mid-30s maybe, with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it, and the kind of lean build that suggested he spent more time thinking than eating. He wore a gray Henley that had seen better days and jeans with paint stains on the knees, and he carried a small toolkit that explained his competence with the stubborn door handle. His eyes were brown, deeper than mine, with the kind of exhaustion around them that came from too many late nights and too much coffee. "Thanks," I said, stepping out of the mailroom and immediately feeling like I could breathe again. "I thought I was going to be in there until morning." "These old buildings," he said with a slight smile. "Everything's held together with prayer and spite. You learn to work around the quirks after a while." I realized I was staring at him, this neighbor I'd passed in hallways dozens of times but never really seen. He had the kind of face that suggested interesting stories. Angular cheekbones and a nose that looked like it might have been broken once, a mouth that seemed more comfortable with silence than small talk. "I'm Chris," I said, extending my hand. "Daniel," he replied, and when our hands met, I felt that small electric shock that comes from unexpected human contact. His grip was firm, calloused in a way that suggested he worked with his hands, though I had no idea what he did for a living. "6B, right?" I said. "I've seen you around, but we've never actually met." "4C," he corrected gently, "though I'm not around much during normal social hours. I tend to keep vampire schedules." This explained why our paths had crossed so rarely despite living in the same building. I was usually in bed by midnight, up early for classes and my part-time job at the campus bookstore. He apparently existed in the spaces between day and night. "What brings you to the mailroom at nearly midnight?" I asked, then immediately regretted the question. It sounded like prying, like the kind of neighborly nosiness that made city living uncomfortable. But Daniel didn't seem bothered by the question. "Same as you, probably, waiting for something that should have arrived days ago. The Postal Service has its own relationship with time that doesn't align with anyone else's expectations." He gestured with his toolkit, and I noticed his hands, long fingers with neat, short nails, a thin scar across one knuckle, the kind of hands that looked like they could build things or fix things or create something beautiful from nothing. "What do you do?" I asked, because something about the late hour and the unexpected rescue made normal conversational boundaries seem less relevant. "Architect," he said. "Mostly residential stuff, though I'm working on a commercial project right now that's slowly destroying my will to live." "What about you? You have the look of someone who spends a lot of time in libraries." "Architecture student, actually," I said, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. "Third year. So I spend a lot of time in libraries and studios, pulling all-nighters over building models that probably violate several laws of physics." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, followed by what looked like interest. "No kidding," he said. "What's your focus? Design? Structural? Urban planning? Sustainable design, mostly. I'm interested in buildings that work with their environment instead of fighting it. Solar orientation, natural ventilation, materials that don't require shipping from halfway around the world." I was talking too much, I realized, but Daniel was listening with the kind of attention I wasn't used to receiving from anyone, much less a stranger in a basement mailroom at midnight. "That's good work," he said simply. "Important work. The industry needs more people thinking that way." We stood in the narrow hallway, and I became aware of the intimacy of the space. The way the overhead lights cast everything in warm amber tones, the way his presence seemed to fill more space than his physical body should have occupied. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said, and something in his tone made my pulse quicken slightly. "Sure." "What are you doing for the rest of the evening? I mean, I know it's late, and you probably have class tomorrow, but—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "I was about to go up to the roof. I do that sometimes when I can't sleep, when I need to think. It's got a good view of the city, and it's quiet. If you're not tired, you're welcome to join me." The invitation surprised me, partly because it came from someone I'd categorized as a polite but distant neighbor, and partly because I realized I wanted to accept it more than I wanted to go back to my apartment and the stack of reading I'd been avoiding. "I'd like that," I said, and I could hear the smile in my own voice. The roof was accessible through a door marked "Emergency Exit Only," though Daniel opened it with the casual confidence of someone who'd done this many times before. A narrow set of metal stairs led up to a flat expanse of tar and gravel, surrounded by a low parapet that provided just enough barrier to make standing near the edge feel safe rather than terrifying. The view was extraordinary. The city spread out below us in all directions, a grid of lights and shadows that pulsed with late-night energy. I could see the university campus to the south, the downtown business district to the north, and the river cutting through everything like a dark ribbon scattered with the reflected lights of bridges. "Wow," I said, moving toward the edge to get a better look. "It's different every time I come up here," Daniel said, joining me at the parapet. "Different lights, different weather, different mood to the whole thing. Sometimes it feels like the most beautiful place in the world, sometimes like the loneliest." "Which is it tonight?" He looked out over the cityscape, then glanced at me, and I felt that electric charge again, stronger now in the cool night air. "Tonight it feels like possibility," he said quietly. We stood side by side, our arms nearly touching on the concrete ledge, and I found myself hyper-aware of his presence. The way he breathed, the way he smelled like soap and coffee and something indefinably masculine, the way the city lights reflected in his dark eyes. "How long have you been coming up here?" I asked. "Since I moved into the building, about 2 years ago. I discovered it by accident, couldn't sleep one night, wandered around exploring, found the door propped open by someone else who'd had the same idea. It became a habit after that." "Do you have trouble sleeping often?" He was quiet for a moment, and I worried I'd pushed into territory too personal for whatever this was. Neighbors sharing an unexpected late-night encounter. More often than I'd like, he said finally. Work stress, mostly. This commercial project I mentioned, it's a big break for me, potentially, but the client keeps changing their mind about fundamental aspects of the design. I've redesigned the entire building 3 times in the past month, and I'm starting to wonder if they actually want it built or if they just enjoy watching me slowly lose my sanity. What kind of building? Mixed-use development downtown, retail on the ground floor, offices above, residential on the top floors. The concept is solid, but the execution has been... He ran a hand through his hair in what I was beginning to recognize as a nervous gesture. Challenging. Can I see the plans sometime? I asked, then immediately wondered if that was presumptuous. I mean, if you don't mind, I'd be curious to see how theory translates into real projects. Daniel looked at me with an expression that was hard to read in the dim lighting. You really want to see architectural drawings? Most people's eyes glaze over when I start talking about floor plans and building codes. I'm not most people, I said, which was probably true in more ways than just professional interest. No, he said softly. I don't think you are. Something in his tone made my breath catch slightly. We were still standing close enough that I could see the silver threads in his dark hair, close enough to notice that his eyes weren't just brown but had flecks of amber near the pupils. What about you? Daniel asked. What keeps you up at night? Besides locked mailroom doors, I mean. I thought about this, about the honest answer versus the polite answer, about how much truth I was willing to share with someone I'd known for less than an hour. School, partly, I said. But also just the future, I guess. Wondering if I'm making the right choices, if I'm good enough at this to actually make a career out of it. Sometimes I lie in bed at 3 in the morning wondering if I should have picked something more practical, something with clearer job prospects. What would you do instead? I have no idea, I admitted. That's part of the problem. Architecture is the only thing I've ever really wanted to do, but wanting something and being capable of succeeding at it aren't necessarily the same thing. Daniel turned to face me more fully, leaning his hip against the parapet. The movement brought him closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool night air. Can I tell you something? He said. As someone who's been doing this professionally for over a decade. I nodded. Self-doubt is part of the job. Every project, every client meeting, every design decision, you question whether you're making the right choices. The ones who don't question themselves are usually the ones creating buildings that shouldn't exist. The fact that you care enough to worry about it suggests you're probably exactly where you should be. The kindness in his voice, the way he spoke to my insecurities without dismissing them, made something warm unfurl in my chest. When was the last time someone had offered me that kind of professional encouragement? When was the last time someone had taken my concerns seriously instead of just telling me to relax? Thank you, I said. That helps more than you probably realize. I had someone tell me something similar when I was starting out, Daniel said. A professor who probably saved my career by convincing me not to quit during a particularly brutal semester. Sometimes we just need someone to remind us that struggling doesn't mean failing. We fell into comfortable silence, looking out over the city lights. A police siren wailed somewhere in the distance, and I could hear the late-night hum of traffic from the highway that cut along the eastern edge of the downtown area. The night felt suspended around us, like we existed in a pocket of time separate from the rest of the world. Can I ask you something personal? Daniel said eventually. Sure, I said, though my heart rate picked up slightly. Do you ever feel lonely? I mean, really lonely. Not just alone, but disconnected from everything around you. The question caught me off guard with its directness, its vulnerability. Most people, especially people I barely knew, didn't ask about loneliness like it was a concrete thing that could be discussed and examined. Yes, I said simply, because anything else would have been a lie. Me too, he said quietly. more often than I'd like to admit. I spend my days designing spaces for people to live and work and connect with each other. But my own life feels isolated, I guess. Like I'm observing other people's happiness from a distance. I knew exactly what he meant. I spent my days surrounded by classmates and professors and customers at the bookstore, but most of my interactions felt surface level, performative in a way that left me feeling more alone than if I'd just stayed home. When did it start? I asked. The loneliness, I mean. Daniel was quiet for so long that I thought he might not answer. A delivery truck rumbled past on the street below, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Hard to say exactly, he said finally. Maybe it was always there and I just got better at noticing it. But it definitely got worse after my last relationship ended, about 8 months ago. He didn't elaborate and I didn't push, but I could hear something in his voice, not just sadness, but a kind of resigned acceptance that suggested the ending hadn't been his choice. What about you? He asked. Ever been in love? Had your heart broken by someone who didn't deserve the privilege? The question was asked lightly, but I could sense real curiosity behind it, like my answer mattered to him in some way I couldn't quite understand. Once, I said. Or I thought I was, anyway. Looking back, I'm not sure if it was love or just familiarity. We were together for almost 2 years and it was comfortable and predictable, and I thought that's what relationships were supposed to be like. What changed? He did, I said simply. Or maybe I did. Or maybe we just grew in different directions and didn't notice until we were too far apart to bridge the gap. Either way, it ended with a conversation that was more like a business meeting than a breakup. Very civil, very rational, very devoid of anything resembling passion. Daniel nodded like he understood exactly what I was describing. Sometimes the quiet endings are harder than the dramatic ones. At least with drama, you know something important was at stake. Exactly, I said, surprised by how well he'd captured what I'd been feeling. I kept thinking that if it had mattered more to either of us, we would have fought for it. The fact that we didn't suggested maybe it was never as real as I'd convinced myself it was. Do you miss it? The relationship, I mean. I considered this, looking out over the city lights while I tried to untangle my actual feelings from what I thought I should be feeling. I miss the idea of it, I said finally. I miss having someone to text when something interesting happens, someone who knows how I like my coffee, someone whose presence makes ordinary things feel less ordinary. But I don't miss him, specifically, which probably says everything about why it didn't work. Daniel was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between understanding and curiosity, and perhaps something else entirely. That's very honest, he said. Is it? I feel like I should miss him more than I do. Like the fact that I don't makes me shallow or incapable of real attachment. Or maybe it just means you're honest about what you actually felt versus what you thought you were supposed to feel, Daniel said gently. There's nothing wrong with recognizing that someone was wrong for you, even if they weren't a bad person. The wisdom in this, the way he seemed to understand the complexity of failed relationships without judgment, made me want to keep talking, to keep sharing things I rarely discussed with anyone. What about your relationship? I asked. The one that ended 8 months ago. Daniel leaned forward, resting his forearms on the parapet, and I could see him weighing how much he wanted to reveal. Michael, he said finally. We were together for 4 years. Lived together for the last 2. He was a lawyer, corporate law, very successful, very driven. We had this apartment in Midtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the river, and from the outside it probably looked like we had everything figured out. He paused, and I waited, sensing there was more. But we were living parallel lives that occasionally intersected, he continued. He worked 80-hour weeks, I worked 60-hour weeks, and when we were both home at the same time, we were too exhausted to do anything but exist in the same space. We'd sit on the couch watching Netflix, both of us on our phones, having separate experiences while occupying the same room. What ended it? He met someone else, Daniel said simply. Someone at his firm who understood his world in a way I never did. Someone who could match his energy and ambition and desire to climb whatever ladder he was focused on climbing. He didn't cheat, at least not physically, but he fell in love with someone else while we were still together, and he was honest enough to tell me instead of just letting us drift further apart. The pain in his voice was subtle but unmistakable, and I felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness toward this man I barely knew. "I'm sorry," I said. "That must have been devastating." "It was," he admitted, "but it was also clarifying, in a strange way. I realized I'd been holding on to the relationship more out of habit than genuine connection. We'd built this life together that looked successful from the outside, but it didn't actually make either of us happy." "Do you regret it?" "The 4 years, I mean." Daniel considered this, looking out over the cityscape. "No," he said eventually. "It taught me what I don't want, which is almost as valuable as knowing what I do want. I don't want to be with someone who sees me as a placeholder for their real life. I don't want to settle for comfortable when I could have something that actually matters." And what would that look like? Something that actually matters? He turned to look at me then, and in the dim light from the city below, his expression was intense in a way that made my breath catch. "I think it would look like this," he said quietly. "Like standing on a rooftop at midnight with someone who asks questions because they actually want to know the answers. Like feeling understood by someone you just met in a way you never felt understood by someone you lived with for years." The honesty of it hung between us, heavy with implication. I could feel my heart beating faster, could feel the careful distance I usually maintained from new people beginning to collapse. "Daniel," I said, though I wasn't sure what I intended to follow it with. "I know," he said. "This is crazy. We just met, and I'm telling you things I haven't told anyone, and you're probably thinking I'm some lonely older guy who reads too much into friendly conversation." "I'm not thinking that," I said quickly. "I'm thinking that this feels more real than anything I've experienced in months. Maybe years." Relief washed over his features, followed by something that looked like hope. "Really? Really?" I came down to check my mail and ended up having the most honest conversation I've had with anyone in, I can't even remember how long. If that's not worth staying up past midnight for, I don't know what is. We stood there in the cool night air, looking at each other, and I could feel something shifting between us, some recognition of possibility that neither of us had expected to find. The city spread out below us, millions of people living their separate lives, and yet here we were, two strangers who'd somehow found each other in the space between one day and the next. "Can I show you something, Daniel asked suddenly. "Of course." He pulled out his phone and scrolled through what appeared to be hundreds of photos until he found what he was looking for. The screen showed an architectural rendering, clean lines, lots of glass, a building that seemed to grow organically from its surroundings. "This is what the downtown project was supposed to look like," he said, before the client decided they wanted more traditional design elements and less experimental features, which basically means they want a glass box that looks like every other glass box in the city. I studied the image, noting the way the building seemed to breathe with its environment, the way natural light would flow through carefully planned spaces, the way form followed function in ways that were both beautiful and practical. "This is incredible," I said, and I meant it. "The way you've oriented it to maximize solar gain in winter but minimize it in summer, the natural ventilation system, the green roof integration. This is exactly the kind of work I want to do someday." Daniel's face lit up in a way that transformed his entire appearance. "You really think so? You're not just being polite?" "I'm not just being polite. This is the future of architecture, or it should be. Buildings that work with the environment instead of against it, that consider their impact beyond just the immediate footprint. That's what I keep trying to tell the client, but they're more concerned with cost per square foot and maximum rentable space than they are with sustainability or innovation. Maybe they're not the right client for this kind of work. Maybe not, Daniel agreed. But good clients are hard to find, and I can't afford to be too picky if I want to keep paying rent. I handed his phone back, and our fingers brushed as he took it, that same electric shock I'd felt when we shook hands earlier. But this time, neither of us pulled away immediately. His thumb traced across my knuckles, a touch so light it might have been accidental, but the way his eyes searched mine suggested it was entirely intentional. "Chris," he said, my name barely above a whisper. "Yeah?" "I need to tell you something, and I want you to know that there's no pressure here, no expectation. But sitting here with you talking about work and life and all the things I don't usually discuss with anyone, it feels important. You feel important." My pulse picked up at his admission, at the vulnerability it took to say something like that to someone you'd known for less than 2 hours. "You feel important to me too," I said, because it was true, because something about this unexpected encounter had shifted something fundamental in my chest. He moved closer then, close enough that I could see the exact color of his eyes in the reflected city lights, close enough to count the silver threads in his dark hair. His hand was still touching mine, and I could feel the warmth of his palm, the slight calluses on his fingertips. I haven't felt this kind of connection with someone in... He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Maybe ever. Certainly not with someone I just met. It's terrifying and exhilarating and completely unexpected." "What are you saying?" I asked, though I could hear my own pulse in my ears. "I'm saying that I'd like to see where this goes, if you're interested. I'd like to take you to dinner tomorrow night, show you more of those architectural plans, have more conversations that last until sunrise. I'd like to find out if this feeling, this connection, is as real as it seems right now." The honesty of his request, the way he'd laid out exactly what he wanted without trying to disguise it as something casual, made my chest tight with possibility. "I'd like that too," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "Really?" "Really. Though I should probably mention that my experience with dating architects is limited to exactly 0, so you'll have to be patient with me if I don't understand all the technical terminology." He laughed, and the sound was rich and warm in the cool night air. "I think I can work with that. My experience dating architecture students is also limited to exactly 0, so we'll be figuring it out together." The wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the scent of the city, exhaust and concrete and the distant smell of someone's late-night cooking. I shivered, though whether from the temperature or from the proximity of Daniel's body I couldn't say. "You're cold," he observed. "A little," I admitted. Without hesitation, he shrugged out of his jacket and draped it around my shoulders. The gesture was simple, practical, but it felt intimate in a way that made my breath catch. The jacket smelled like him. Soap and coffee and something clean and masculine, and wearing it felt like being wrapped in his attention. "Thank you," I said. "Thank you for staying up here with me. For listening, for sharing, for making tonight feel less lonely than most nights." We stood there wrapped in comfortable silence, the city lights twinkling below us like earthbound stars. I could feel the weight of possibility between us, the sense that we were standing at the beginning of something that could be significant. "I should probably let you get some sleep," Daniel said eventually, though he made no move to step away from me. "You have class tomorrow, and I've already kept you up way past any reasonable hour." "I don't mind," I said, which was completely true. "This has been the best part of my week, maybe my month." "Mine too," he said softly. But even as we acknowledged that the night was ending, neither of us moved toward the door that would take us back to our separate apartments, our separate lives. The moment felt too fragile, too precious to break with something as mundane as going to bed. "Chris," Daniel said, his voice rough with something I couldn't quite identify. "Yeah?" He hesitated, and I could see him wrestling with something, some decision that felt larger than the simple mechanics of saying goodnight. "You don't have to go yet," he said finally, his eyes searching mine in the dim light. "If you don't want to." The words hung between us in the cool night air, heavy with promise and possibility, and the kind of risk that could change everything. I felt suspended in that moment, balanced on the edge of something that felt both terrifying and inevitable, with his jacket around my shoulders and his eyes asking questions I wasn't sure I knew how to answer. But as I looked at him, this unexpected man who'd rescued me from a locked room and then opened doors I didn't even know existed, I realized that maybe I didn't need to know all the answers. Maybe some things were worth jumping into without a blueprint, without a plan, without any guarantee of how they'd turn out. Maybe some things were worth the risk of not knowing what came next. My lonely older neighbor changed my life forever. Gay Story, Part 2. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a dying cigarette, soft and hazy but impossible to ignore. You don't have to go yet, if you don't want to. His voice had carried something I'd never heard before. Not just loneliness, but hope. Fragile, tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, someone might choose to stay. I stood there in his doorway, one foot already on the threshold, my jacket half shrugged over my shoulders. The rain had picked up again, drumming against the windows with renewed intensity, as if the world itself was conspiring to keep me here. My heart hammered against my ribs with such force I was certain he could hear it in the quiet space between us. The word escaped before I could stop it, hanging incomplete in the air. What was I supposed to say? That I'd been hoping he'd ask? That leaving felt like tearing something essential away from my chest? That in the span of one evening, this man had become more real to me than anyone I'd ever known? His eyes searched mine with an almost painful vulnerability, and I realized he was holding his breath, waiting, terrified of my answer but brave enough to ask the question anyway. In that moment, I saw past the careful walls he'd built around himself, past the polite distance and practiced solitude. I saw a man who had been alone for so long that asking someone to stay felt like stepping off a cliff. I let my jacket slide from my shoulders, the fabric whispering against itself as it fell. "I don't want to go," I said quietly, the truth of it settling over me like warm water. "Not yet." The relief that washed over his features was almost too intimate to witness. He stepped back, creating space for me to enter fully, and I found myself crossing back over the threshold, not just into his apartment, but into something uncharted and terrifying and beautiful. He closed the door with deliberate care, the soft click of the latch somehow more significant than it should have been. We were sealed in together now, just us and the rain and whatever was building between us like electrical charge before a storm. "I should make some tea," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. "Or coffee. Do you drink coffee this late? I have decaf, or ... quote. He was rambling, nervous energy making his usually steady hands flutter as he gestured toward the kitchen. "I'm sorry, I don't have people over. I'm not sure what the protocol is." The honesty of his admission made something tender unfurl in my chest. "Tea sounds perfect," I said gently. "Can I help?" He nodded, perhaps too quickly, and led me into his small kitchen. It was immaculately clean, everything in its place with the kind of precision that spoke of too much time and too little distraction. I watched him move around the space with practiced efficiency, filling the kettle, reaching for mugs that looked like they rarely saw use beyond his morning routine. "Chamomile okay?" he asked, holding up a small wooden box. "It's supposed to be calming, though I'm not sure anything could calm my nerves right now." The admission slipped out so quietly I almost missed it, but when our eyes met across the small kitchen, I realized he'd meant for me to hear it. This was his way of telling me that I wasn't alone in feeling like I was balanced on the edge of something vast and unknown. Mine either, I admitted, accepting the vulnerability he'd offered and matching it with my own. But chamomile sounds good. We worked in companionable silence, the simple ritual of making tea creating a buffer against the intensity of what we weren't yet saying. He moved with unconscious grace despite his nervousness, and I found myself studying the way his fingers handled the delicate porcelain cups, the concentration that creased his brow as he measured out the tea leaves. When the kettle began its quiet whistle, he poured the water with steady hands, steam rising between us like incense. The familiar, soothing scent of chamomile began to fill the small space, and something in both of us seemed to settle slightly. "Should we sit?" he asked, gesturing toward the living room with its warm lamplight and the couch where we'd spent the evening talking. Where everything had changed without either of us quite realizing it was happening. I nodded, accepting one of the mugs from his hands. Our fingers brushed in the exchange, just for a moment, just skin against skin, but the contact sent a jolt through me that had nothing to do with the warmth of the ceramic. We settled on opposite ends of the couch, perhaps a little more carefully than before, both of us hyper-aware of the space between us and the weight of what we'd left unspoken. The rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, and the lamp cast everything in soft, golden tones that made the moment feel suspended, dreamlike. I sipped my tea and watched him over the rim of my mug. He was staring into his cup as if it might contain answers to questions he was afraid to ask, his profile etched with a kind of gentle melancholy that made me want to reach out and smooth the worry from his brow. "I haven't done this in a while," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "What?" "Made tea?" I asked, though we both knew that wasn't what he meant. A soft smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Had someone want to stay?" The simple honesty of it hit me like a physical blow. Here was this beautiful, thoughtful man who had somehow convinced himself that he wasn't worth staying for. The injustice of it made something fierce and protective rise in my chest. "How long has it been?" I asked gently. "Since someone stayed, I mean." He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years. "My partner, my last partner. He left about 3 years ago. Said I was too." He paused, searching for the right words. Too quiet. Too content to stay home. Too old to change. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Maybe he was right. "He was wrong," I said with such immediate certainty that he looked up, startled. "About all of it. Especially about you being too old to change." "How can you know that?" "You barely know me." I set down my mug and turned to face him more fully. "Because you asked me to stay. Because you're sitting here, nervous and brave and willing to let someone see you. That's not someone who can't change. That's someone who's ready to." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. "What about you?" he asked. "When was the last time you stayed somewhere you weren't supposed to?" The question caught me off guard, and I realized with a start that I couldn't remember. When had I become so careful, so determined to keep everything light and surface level? When had I stopped taking risks with my heart? "Too long," I admitted. "Way too long." We fell into silence again, but it felt different now. Not uncomfortable, but charged with possibility. The space between us seemed to pulse with everything we weren't quite ready to say. "I used to paint," he said suddenly, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they surprised me. "Before everything. I had this little studio apartment when I was your age, and I'd spend entire weekends just creating, losing myself in color and texture and light." "What happened to it?" I asked. "The painting." He shrugged, but I could see the pain he was trying to hide. "Life, I suppose. Jobs that demanded more hours, a relationship that needed more attention. practical things that seemed more important at the time. He paused, staring into his tea. I kept telling myself I'd get back to it later. When things calmed down. When I had more time. When. And now? Now I realize that later is a lie we tell ourselves when we're afraid. Afraid the thing we love won't love us back. Afraid we're not good enough. Afraid of failing. He looked at me then, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. I haven't picked up a brush in over 2 years. The confession hung between us like a bridge I could choose to cross or ignore. I thought of all the things I'd abandoned, all the dreams I'd labeled impractical, all the times I'd chosen safety over passion. "What would you paint now?" I asked softly. "If you picked up a brush tomorrow?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was almost inaudible. "This. Tonight. The way the lamplight catches in your hair. The way the rain sounds against the windows. The feeling of—" He stopped, as if he'd revealed too much. The feeling of what? Of not being alone. The words settled over me like a warm blanket, and I realized we'd crossed some invisible line without either of us meaning to. The conversation had become something more than small talk, more than the careful dance of two people getting to know each other. It had become confession, communion, the kind of raw honesty that only happens in the space between strangers and intimates. I found myself shifting closer on the couch, drawn by some magnetic pull I couldn't name. He noticed the movement and went very still, like a wild animal afraid of being startled into flight. "Tell me about your dreams," I said, my voice soft enough not to break whatever spell we were weaving. "The ones you've never told anyone." He laughed, but it was breathless, uncertain. "That's a dangerous question." "I know." He set down his mug with trembling hands and turned to face me fully. In the lamplight, his face was open, vulnerable, more beautiful than I'd ever noticed. "I dream about a little house somewhere quiet, with a garden and a studio with north-facing windows. I dream about Sunday mornings that stretch into afternoons and someone to share them with. Someone who doesn't mind that I take too long to choose what to watch on television, or that I talk to my plants, or that I cry during movies." He paused, his eyes searching mine. "Silly dreams for a man my age." "They're not silly," I whispered. "They're beautiful." "What about you? What do you dream about?" The question should have been simple, but as I sat there looking into his eyes, I realized I'd been sleepwalking through my own life for so long that I'd forgotten how to dream. Or maybe I'd been too afraid to let myself want anything real. "I dream about belonging somewhere," I heard myself say. "Really belonging, not just visiting. I dream about conversations that last until dawn and feeling brave enough to be completely honest with someone." I dream about. I faltered, suddenly aware of how close we'd become, how the space between us had shrunk to mere inches. "About what?" "About someone looking at me the way you're looking at me right now." The admission hung in the air between us, fragile and true. His breath caught, and I watched something shift in his expression, surprise giving way to recognition, recognition giving way to something deeper and more dangerous. "How am I looking at you?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Like I matter, like you see me." "I do see you," he whispered. "God, I see you." Without conscious thought, my hand found its way to his knee, just a soft touch, fingers barely making contact through the fabric of his jeans, but the connection sent electricity racing up my arm. He looked down at my hand as if it were something miraculous and impossible. "Is this okay?" I asked, suddenly uncertain. Instead of answering with words, he covered my hand with his own. His palm was warm and slightly calloused, and the weight of it anchored me to the moment in a way that felt both terrifying and essential. We sat like that for what felt like hours, hands layered together on his knee, rain creating a symphony against the windows. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of all the things we were learning about each other without speaking. The way he breathed, slightly uneven with nerves and anticipation. The way his thumb traced unconscious patterns against my knuckles. The way the space between us seemed to hum with possibility. "I should probably tell you," he said eventually, his voice barely audible, "that I haven't done this in a very long time. I'm probably rusty at all of this." "Done what?" "Let someone in. Let someone close enough to—" He trailed off, but his meaning hung clear in the space between us. Close enough to what? He lifted our joined hands, studying the way our fingers had somehow become interlaced without either of us planning it. "Close enough to hurt me," he said with devastating honesty. The confession broke something open in my chest. Here was this man, brave enough to name his fear, brave enough to risk it anyway. I thought of all the walls I'd built around my own heart, all the ways I'd learned to keep people at arm's length to avoid exactly this kind of vulnerability. "You're not the only one who's rusty," I admitted. "I've gotten pretty good at keeping things casual, keeping people from getting too close." "What changed?" I looked at him then, really looked at him, the gentle lines around his eyes, the way his hair had fallen slightly across his forehead, the vulnerable set of his mouth. "You," I said simply. "Tonight. This." Something shifted in his expression, and I realized we'd reached another precipice. The kind of moment where everything could change with a single choice, a single movement forward or back. He lifted his free hand slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away, and brushed his fingertips against my cheek. The touch was feather-light, reverent, as if he couldn't quite believe he was allowed this intimacy. "You're so young," he murmured, and there was something almost like grief in his voice. "I'm not that young," I said softly. "And you're not that old. Sometimes I feel ancient." "You don't look ancient. You look—" I struggled to find words for the way he looked in the lamplight, vulnerable and beautiful and more present than anyone I'd ever met. "You look like someone who's been waiting for something without knowing what it was." His thumb traced along my cheekbone, and I leaned into the touch before I could stop myself. "Maybe I was," he whispered. "Maybe I was waiting for you." The words should have been too much, too soon, too intense for whatever this was between us. Instead, they felt like recognition, like something I'd been waiting to hear my entire life without knowing it. I turned my face into his palm, pressing a soft kiss to the center of his hand. I felt him shudder at the contact, saw the way his eyes fluttered closed, as if the sensation was almost too much to bear. When he opened his eyes again, they were bright with unshed tears and something that looked like wonder. "I don't know what I'm doing," he confessed. "Neither do I," said, "but I don't want to stop." He leaned closer then, slowly, giving us both time to change our minds, to pull back, to retreat into the safety of distance. Instead, I found myself moving to meet him halfway, drawn by gravity or magnetism or something even more fundamental than that. When our lips met, it was nothing like I'd expected. Not passionate or desperate or hungry, but soft, tentative. A question asked and answered in the space of a heartbeat. His lips were warm and slightly chapped, and they trembled against mine as if he couldn't quite believe this was really happening. The kiss lasted only a moment, but when we pulled apart, everything had changed. We stared at each other in the lamplight, both slightly breathless, both transformed by something as simple and revolutionary as the touch of lips to lips. "Oh," he breathed, and the single syllable contained multitudes, surprise and joy and fear and recognition all tangled together. "Yeah," I whispered back. "Oh." He rested his forehead against mine, and we sat there breathing the same air, sharing the same impossible moment. His hand was still cupped against my cheek, and I could feel the rapid flutter of his pulse where my fingers rested against his wrist. "What happens now?" he asked, and I could hear the fear beneath the wonder in his voice. Fear that this was too good to be real, too fragile to last, too dangerous to trust. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I'd like to find out. If you want to." He pulled back just enough to look into my eyes, searching for something. Sincerity, maybe, or confirmation that I wasn't just playing with his emotions. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him, because he smiled then, soft and genuine and more beautiful than anything I'd ever seen. "I want to," he said simply. The admission hung between us like a promise, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not closure, but opening. The beginning of something that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Without speaking, we shifted on the couch, moving closer together until I could feel the warmth of his body alongside mine. He wrapped his arm around my shoulders with careful hesitancy, as if he still couldn't quite believe I was choosing to stay, choosing this, choosing him. I settled against his side, my head finding the hollow between his shoulder and his chest where I seemed to fit perfectly. His heart was beating fast beneath my ear, and I realized mine was keeping time with his. "Is this okay?" he asked softly, his breath stirring my hair. Instead of answering with words, I turned my face up to his and kissed him again. This time it was less tentative, less questioning. This time it felt like acceptance, like coming home. When we broke apart, he tightened his arms around me, holding me against him as if I might disappear if he let go. Outside, the rain had settled into a steady, soothing rhythm that seemed to wrap around the apartment like a protective cocoon. "I should probably tell you," I said against his chest, "that I have no idea what I'm doing either. This isn't... I don't usually..." "What?" "Feel this way about someone I've just met." It should be terrifying. Should be? I lifted my head to look at him. It is terrifying, but it's also the most right thing I've felt in years. He smoothed my hair back from my forehead with gentle fingers. "I know what you mean. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for this to reveal itself as some kind of elaborate dream. If it is a dream, I don't want to wake up. Neither do I." We fell into comfortable silence then, content simply to hold each other and listen to the rain. His fingers traced lazy patterns along my arm, and I found myself relaxing completely for the first time in longer than I could remember. There was something about being in his arms that made the rest of the world fade away, leaving just this, just us, just this moment, just this impossible tenderness that had bloomed between two strangers in the space of a single evening. "Can I ask you something?" I said eventually. "Anything." "What made you ask me to stay?" "Really?" He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with reflection. "You were standing in my doorway, and I realized that when you left, the apartment was going to feel emptier than it had before you came. Not just quiet, empty. And I thought about going back to my routine, my careful solitude, my safe little existence, and it felt like suffocating." He paused, his hand stilling in my hair. "I've spent so long protecting myself from being hurt that I forgot what it felt like to truly connect with someone. Tonight, with you, I remembered, and I couldn't let you walk away without at least trying to hold on to it a little longer." The honesty of his answer made my throat tight with emotion. "I'm glad you asked. I'm glad you took the risk. Even if we don't know where this leads?" I lifted my head to meet his eyes. "Especially because we don't know where this leads. Maybe the not knowing is the point. Maybe the risk is what makes it worth it." He smiled then, and it was like watching the sun rise. "When did you become so wise?" "About 5 minutes ago," I said, making him laugh. I'm usually terrible at this kind of thing. Ask anyone who's ever tried to date me. What makes you terrible at it? I settled back against his chest, thinking about all the ways I'd sabotaged potential relationships before they could become real. I run away. When things start to feel too intense, too real, too much like they might actually matter, I find reasons to leave. I'm really good at leaving. But you're still here. I'm still here, I agreed, and the truth of it amazed me. What's different this time? The question hung in the air, and I realized I didn't have an easy answer. What was different? Why wasn't I already making excuses, already planning my escape route? You, I said finally. The way you look at me like I'm not going to disappear. The way you asked me to stay, like it mattered to you whether I did. The way you're brave enough to be vulnerable even though it terrifies you. I paused, trying to find words for something I was only just beginning to understand. I think I've been waiting my whole life for someone to make staying feel like the brave choice instead of the safe one. His arms tightened around me, and I felt him press a soft kiss to the top of my head. I never thought of staying as brave, he murmured against my hair. It is, though. Staying means risking everything. It means letting someone see you, really see you, with all your flaws and fears and broken places. It means trusting that they won't use that knowledge to hurt you. I lifted my head to look at him again. It means believing that maybe, just maybe, they'll choose to love those broken places instead of trying to fix them. Something flickered across his expression. Recognition, maybe, or hope. Is that what you're doing? Choosing to stay? Yeah, I said softly. I think I am. We kissed again then, slow and deep and full of all the promises we weren't ready to make with words. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, both slightly overwhelmed by the intensity of what was building between us. The rain had gentled to a whisper against the windows, and the apartment felt like a sanctuary, a place outside of time where two lonely people had found something unexpected and precious. It's late, he said eventually, glancing toward the window where the darkness seemed complete. It is. You could... He started, then stopped, uncertainty creeping back into his voice. I mean, if you wanted to, you could stay. Actually stay. I have a guest room, or the couch is comfortable, or... He was rambling again, nervous about pushing too far too fast. I'd like that, I said simply, and watched relief flood his features. Really? Really. I'm not ready for this to end. Not yet. He helped me settle more comfortably against his side, and I realized I'd never felt safer or more content than I did in that moment, curled up with him on his couch while the rain continued its gentle percussion outside. Thank you, he whispered into the quiet. For what? For staying. For taking the risk. For making me feel less invisible. I turned in his arms so I could see his face. Thank you for asking me to, for being brave enough to want someone to stay. We settled back into comfortable silence, and I found my eyelids growing heavy. The combination of emotional intensity, physical comfort, and the soothing sound of rain was lulling me toward sleep. I felt him relax beneath me, too, his breathing evening out as peace replaced anxiety. Just before I drifted off, I felt him pull a soft throw blanket over both of us, tucking it carefully around my shoulders. The gesture was so tender, so considerate, that it made my heart ache with something I was only just learning to recognize as love, or the possibility of love, the seed of something that could grow into love if we were brave enough to tend it. As sleep claimed me, I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't planning my exit strategy. I wasn't thinking about all the ways this could go wrong, or all the reasons I should protect myself. Instead, I was thinking about tomorrow morning, about waking up to find him still here, still real, still looking at me like I mattered. The last thing I was aware of was his hand stroking gently through my hair and the soft sound of his breathing mixing with the rhythm of the rain. It felt like coming home to a place I'd never been, but had been searching for my entire life. Outside, the storm was beginning to clear, but inside, something new was just beginning to bloom. Something fragile and tentative and beautiful. Something that might be strong enough to weather whatever storms lay ahead if we were brave enough to stay.